How's everybody doing this morning? Good. Well, Pastor David and Pastor Wallace are off at annual conference right now, so you guys are stuck with me. I can do whatever I want now, right? Raises for me. Diana, you want a raise? Where'd you go? She wants a raise, sure. No, that's why we have an ad council. I can't do that. So today we are starting the second story in our series, Tell Me a Story, Bible stories that we tell to kids and that everyone should know. These are stories that many of us may have grown up hearing, but they have really profound lessons that go way beyond just things that kids should know. Everyone can have a takeaway from these stories. So obviously today we're going to be talking about David and Goliath. David and Goliath may be one of the most popular stories from the Bible in our greater culture because of how inspiring it is. It's kind of the ultimate underdog story. Good versus evil, the little guy versus the giant, overcoming the odds. It's fantastic inspiration for sports teams, for belittled employees, really anyone who feels downtrodden. If you're facing an obstacle that looks insurmountable, don't give up because David defeated Goliath after all. Really, the only story that may be quite as famous that has kind of the same message is the little engine that could. You know, I think I can, I think I can. He makes it all the way up the hill and it's glorious. It's so great. But there's got to be a difference between the little engine that could and David and Goliath. There just has to be. So we're going to look a little bit today at what that is. There's a huge difference between the two, but I think to really understand it, we need to know more about the story of David and Goliath, a little bit more detail than we may have heard when we were kids. And we also need to understand the cultural context and the historical context that the story sits in. So obviously the story of David and Goliath is primarily about David. But to really understand the depth of this story, I think we need to know a lot more about one of the seemingly minor characters in this story, and that's King Saul. But to know about King Saul, we got to know about Israel. The youth are kind of catching on. They're like, oh yeah, Brad likes context. He always talks way too much. So yeah, we're going to do more of that. I like it. They don't. It's cool. So to know more about King Saul, we have to know more about Israel. The Israelites were God's chosen people. Last week, Wallace talked about God's covenant with Noah, his promise to Noah. But that wasn't the only covenant that God has made with his people. He's also made a covenant with Abraham. That was one of the most important covenants that God has ever made. And his covenant with Abraham was that he was going to make his descendants like the stars. As numerous as the stars. His descendants were going to become their own people, their own nation. They were going to have a land of their own. They were going to be blessed. They were going to be God's own people. And God stood by that covenant. Abraham's descendants became to be known as the Israelites, and that's basically what the Old Testament is about, following Abraham's descendants, the Israelites, through the story of history. And we thought about a lot of the other stories for this series, stuff like when they were enslaved for a couple hundred years in Egypt and brought out of slavery by Moses as God parted the Red Sea. And then they're in the desert for 40 years, and then they are taken finally into the promised land by Joshua. And what Joshua is doing is God is fulfilling his covenant through Joshua to the Israelites. They are battling these other nations and carving out a place for themselves within the promised land so that they can be established as a nation and a people, and God is with them. And that's exactly what happens. And God is ruling over the Israelites as their king. But also with another common theme in the Old Testament, it doesn't stay too great for long. The Israelites start to lose faith. They start to grow fearful, jealous, and selfish. And though God has been faithful to his covenant with them, the Israelites decide that they would rather be ruled by a human king than by God. They wanted somebody that they could see and relate to. They looked around and they saw all these neighboring nations with these big, impressive kings leading them into battle. And they said, I want that. They felt it may be easier to trust and follow and believe in a human king than it would be to trust and believe and follow God. So, not without warning, that's what God gave them. God said, all right, here you go. I'm going to give you this human king that you want. And he brought forth King Saul. He brought forth Saul to be their king. And he gave Saul a legit chance to be a good king over the Israelites. Scripture tells us that God changed his heart and put his spirit on Saul. And it actually started out pretty good. It started out with Saul trusting God's way and doing things God's way. But as the trials and tribulations started to stack up, Saul grew fearful. He grew fearful mainly of losing his power. Losing his power to God, to his own people, to outside nations. And the whole absolute power corrupts absolutely thing started to take hold. As his fear grew, the more he relied on his way than on God's way. As his fear grew, he truly started to rely on himself. And the less he relied on God. The biggest way that this was manifested was actually on the battlefield. There were lots of people surrounding Israel that did not really like them very much. There were the Ammonites, the Amalekites, the Philistines, and all these guys had mighty armies around them and came to attack the Israelites. And as Saul went up against these armies, it became more and more important and crucial to his ability to hold on to his rule as king in his mind, that he defeat these nations. So as the stakes mounted and these armies came against him, we saw instead of doing things God's way, even though God had told him, this is what I'm going to do. This is how I'm going to help you out. And you're going to be successful. Things made more sense to Saul by doing things his own way. So that's what he did. And in doing so, he really relegated to God to being not much more than a figurehead or a good luck charm. He said that God's way mattered, and he kind of pretended, I guess, to care what God had to say, but his actions and his attitude showed something different entirely. That God was really no more than a backup plan in case Saul's way failed. Saul's faith was not really so much in God as it was in himself. So it's in this context that we meet King David, who is really King Saul's foil in faith. King Saul's faith was truly in himself, and he cared most about his glory and put his glory above God's. David, meanwhile, kept his faith fully in God, stayed humble, and put obedience and trust above fear and vanity. And nothing exemplifies this story more than David and Goliath. So David comes on the scene after God has just completely lost faith and patience in King Saul. It actually says that God took his spirit away from King Saul, and he regretted having made him king. So that means it's time for a new king. So God sends the prophet Samuel to Bethlehem. Foreshadowing. Flashing lights. Sends Samuel, the prophet, to Bethlehem to find the next king. And he tells Samuel that it is going to be one of the sons of Jesse, who is a local shepherd. And so Jesse brings all of his sons in front of Samuel, and the oldest is introduced, and he's strong, and he's tall, and he's handsome. And Samuel's like, this has got to be the guy. God says, no, this isn't the one. So there's just a parade of sons going in front of Samuel, from the oldest all the way down to Jesse runs out of sons, except for David, who's still out in the field, his youngest. And he's brought in front of Samuel. And all we really know about him at this point is that he's young-ish, probably around 12 years old, maybe, and that he's healthy-looking and handsome. And God tells Samuel, this is the guy, and he is anointed as the next king of Israel in secret. Got to be in secret, because as you know, King Saul, he's not going to like that, right? So funny enough, David is put right into King Saul's service, and he is made his armor bearer. And Saul actually grows to love David. He really likes being around him. He really grows to enjoy David and his company. But it is not long before the mighty Philistines come and gather their armies against Israel. The Philistines are kind of this perpetual headache and the bully on the block for the Israelites. And here we see Goliath introduced. Goliath is introduced, and he is a literal giant of a man, 9 feet 9 inches tall. His armor and helmet alone weigh 125 pounds. That's heavy. He's carrying a javelin and a spear where the head of the spear alone weighs 15 pounds. And he marches out on the battlefield facing the Israelites, and he gives his challenge. A one-on-one battle to the death. If I win, you become our servants. If you win, we'll become your servants. Pick your champion, whoever you want. Let's do this. Silence. For 40 days, Goliath comes out and he offers his challenge, and it goes unmet for 40 days. Meanwhile, David is just a teenager. He's not even of age to battle quite yet. So he's going back and forth between serving Saul and back home with his father Jesse, taking care of the sheep while his brothers are off to battle. So one day Jesse sends David to the battle lines to send provisions for the other sons. And while he's there, David hears Goliath give his challenge. And his reaction is very different from everyone else's. He hears Goliath's challenge, and instead of being fearful and afraid right away, he's like, who does this punk think he is? He's talking about God. He's going to take on God? All right, let's see that. And in that small phrase, I think we really see in that reaction the key difference between David's faith and Saul's faith. Between David's faith and the way that everyone around him acts. Everyone else is actually seeing things really logically. They're sizing up the Philistine army and their own army. They're looking out and seeing Goliath and then looking at themselves. And they are doing the logical thing. They are fearing defeat and death. As someone who is a pragmatist through and through, I really appreciate and sympathize with this way of thinking. Their actions actually make complete sense. But while they're looking at things logically, they're missing a piece. They're missing the piece of God's presence, of his promise, and of his faithfulness. And I bet if you ask these guys, if you went up to each one of them who's like, not me, and you asked them, well, didn't God promise that he was going to be with you? Isn't he all-powerful? Didn't he say that he was going to deliver you from your enemies? Didn't he say all these things? They would say, well, yeah, of course I believe that. But what they have is the right answers. They've got the answers in their head. But I'm not sure that they have the faith and the belief in their heart. They can give you all the answers all day long, but it's not a truth that has penetrated their minds into their hearts and really affected the way that they think and the way that they believe and the way that they act. Their faith is the same as Saul's faith. But then there's David. He's young and probably a bit naive, but I don't think that we can pretend that he's really misunderstanding the situation. He's still like 15-ish years old, and that dude's still 9'9" and terrifying. So I don't think we can really pretend that David didn't really see what was going on. He knew exactly what was going on. But I think he just saw the situation a little bit differently from everyone else. Have you guys ever seen in the movie where there's like the hero who has this awesome escape plan, or maybe it's a blueprint for a really cool weapon, and each part of the plan is written on a different piece of kind of like semi-translucent paper, and then really dramatically they put them all together and flatten it out, and you can see the whole picture of everything? I think that's what's going on here. The Israelites, they've got a picture of what's going on, and it makes sense to them. But David kind of has this last overlapping sheet of paper that describes God's goodness and his power and his strength. And he lays that on top, and he's like, plan. I got nothing to fear. Here's the plan. This is what's going to happen. For David, God's sovereignty is not just a fact that he knows. It changes the way that he sees and understands the world. And he's got enough faith in it that he's willing to put his life on the line and believe it. So that's what he does. He becomes Israel's champion. He steps out there on the field with his staff, his sling, and a bag full of 5 stones. And he walks out there, takes one of the stones, puts it in there, and puts the stone straight through Goliath's forehead and kills him. Awesome. That's the part of the story we tell our kids, the gruesome death. It's not even over. He goes and he steals Goliath's sword and beheads him. That's the part we tell our kids. Wonderful. Isn't that great? But there are a few more details in the story that I think are actually more important that we need to go into a little bit more. And the first is David's speech to Goliath. And that's actually what Rick just read for us a little bit earlier. Goliath's challenge has gone unaccepted for 40 days. And then this pretty boy shepherd comes out, and he's the one who accepts the challenge. So, of course, he's going to talk a little bit of trash. And he insults David. He insults David's God, which is nothing new. And he says that the animals and the birds are going to pick the flesh off of David's bones. But David is not just the future king of Israel. He's also the king of trash talk. And he's got a little bit of a response for Goliath. And in his response, we see a lot about David's character and his faith and who he is. First of all, he makes it abundantly clear, and this may be the most important thing, that he is coming out to challenge Goliath not for his own glory or because he feels threatened, but in the name of God. He's doing it because Goliath is standing in opposition to God. And you don't do that. That is why, that plain and simple is the reason that he's going out against Goliath, is that Goliath is standing in opposition of God. And so second, and related to that, is that David tells Goliath that this isn't him coming out against God, but this is going to be God